Thank you very much, everybody, for first of all being here at the CTC Virtual iDay. This next session is really another roundtable discussion around the critical issue of cyber. I'm Ward Cheng. I'm with Aon, and I'm also adjunct professor at USC. We have a distinguished panel, and I'm really excited about having colleagues, both Jasmine Klein from Marsh and Sean Ram from Coalition on today. This discussion is mission critical for most organizations right now, and this really originated about a year ago when I was doing a panel with Sean and a couple of others around the question of innovation in the insurance space. One of the working hypotheses is that insurance has a tendency to be slow when it comes to reacting to new kinds of emerging risks. The process of pulling capital together, the process of doing underwriting, the process of developing a product and tool that goes into the marketplace that people will actually buy, it tends to be slow. It tends to take years sometimes. And for something like cyber, it's been a dramatically robust and very, very difficult risk to manage. And what I've got today is a presentation and a discussion with Jasmine and with Sean that I hope will provide you with some additional insights into how we might think differently about underwriting risk, how we might think differently about deploying technology in this space. So with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Sean Ram. Sean is currently head of insurance at Coalition, a company that was founded at the intersection of insurance and cybersecurity industries by a team of insurance technology and intelligence community veterans. Sean is responsible for Coalition's insurance operations, including underwriting, claims, distribution, actuarial, and customer success and strategic partnerships. Sean and I worked together previously when we were both at Aon, and Sean is going to continue this discussion with me in another week at the Hawaii Captive Insurance Council meeting in the islands. Jasmine, would you reintroduce yourself, please?
Sure. Hi, everyone. For those of you who are just joining, I'm Jasmine Klein. I work for Marsh in our management liability practice. I was formerly lucky to be a student of Ward Cheng. I graduated from USC in May 2020 from the risk management program, but really excited to be part of this discussion with Sean.
So Jasmine, if you would bring up the slides.
Will do.
And what I'm going to do is, first of all, Sean, thank you for being here. It's great to see you, and it's great to be back on a panel with you. What I want to do is set you up. So if we go to the next slide, the question is, where is cyber today? And clearly, the market conditions on the demand side, there are really very limited long-term solutions. There are issues associated with evidence of minimum levels, terms and conditions, continued capacity erosion, although in some cases we're seeing some reversal. There's really a significant increase in demand for what's going on out there, and retentions are continuing to grow. Variations on retentions are out there, and pricing continues to be a problem. You've attacked that issue. In the next slide, what we see, and this is an updated slide from a colleague of mine, Sam Tashima, on the actuarial side, and that is, if we look at what's actually been driving the cyber liability issue, it's come in two areas. The first, and more historically, it's been in the area of non-ransomware or data breach. So 10, 15 years ago, everybody's concern was somebody's coming in to take my data. Somebody's going to use that data in a different fashion. And as you can see in this slide, ranging back to the 2019 period through 2023, the incidences, at least insurable incidences of breach, have been relatively constant and relatively low. Where we've seen a dramatic change in the cyberspace is in ransomware. And this is a space where, Sean, you've been spending a lot of attention and time. As you can see, this is growing exponentially. And what we're seeing also in this space is the industrialization of the ransomware market, where there are producers of ransomware opportunities. There are fulfillers of ransomware opportunities. There is a whole supply chain associated with ransomware, and then some of you maybe have experiences as well. But there are actually some individuals in the marketplace, the bad guys, that are offering payment terms as if this was a credit kind of approach. So you've got a ransomware situation. They're offering you terms. So this is a very different kind of environment right now. And what we've seen is it's continuing to grow. Ransomware is up by 4%. Non-ransomware data breaches down by 9%. More and more, we're seeing industries impacted directly. Business professional services, manufacturing, real estate, education, healthcare. And what's not here is municipalities. So you'll see a city or a town impacted with a ransomware issue that can be devastating. And so the first thing to recognize is all cyber is not equal. If you go to the next slide, what you see is essentially the frequency rate changing by various quarters. So we're seeing ransom events continuing its upward trajectory in 2023. We're seeing non-ransomware data essentially unchanged year over year in Q3 2023. And we're showing a 169% increase in ransom attacks for the 3 months from June through August of 2023 compared to the same time frame in 2022. And the question is why? Where does this come from? How does this work? We're also seeing this coming from overseas. So we're seeing activity all over the world, and I know Sean's going to be talking about that in a moment. But the idea is that this is a pervasive issue. And if we go to one last slide in setting things up, notice the change in trajectory year over year. So 2020 through 2023. Notice the gap between 2022 and 2023 in terms of the cumulative ransomware frequency growing by month. This is a pervasive issue, and for most of the risk registers that have been published, where there has been CEO and C-suite surveying of the most material risks to the enterprise, the whole issue associated with cyber tends to be number one and has been in that position for quite some time, with the exception of 2020 when we were dealing with the pandemic issues. So this is a pervasive question. This is an interesting question, and the question is, how has the insurance industry responded? And for many, the response has been slow and maybe not as targeted as the bad guys they're well ahead of us. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Sean around what have you done? What is Coalition? What have you done? How have you developed your technologies? What is your approach? Because you're staking a claim that's very, very different from everybody else's. Sean.
Yeah, thank you for teeing that up, Ward. Certainly appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today and tell you just about how we think about cyber, and most notably, the manner in which we underwrite cyber. We believe that cyber is the most pervasive risk in society today, that it permeates across, as Ward mentioned, not only every industry segment, every revenue segment of company, but it also permeates throughout every kind of historical insuring agreement across the insurance industry as well. Cyber is something that, as Ward mentioned, has changed quite dramatically over the last 10 to 12 years. 2011 regarded by many 2012 as the year of the breach, with Home Depot and Target and many others. And then, we started our company Coalition in 2017. Well, the topic of the day in 2017 was really around social engineering and this idea of receiving an email asking a CFO to transfer money, not realizing that the bank details had changed. As Ward highlighted, in the middle of the pandemic and today, if you solve ransomware, you solve cyber. And there aren't many broad areas of insurance-related coverage that have this dramatic shift in claims activity in such a short period of time, because of the dynamic nature in which cyber activity occurs. the accelerated rate in which adversaries look at new threat vectors, we believe that there was a different way in which we could and should address this pervasive risk we call cyber today. So this just attempts to highlight a few facts about Coalition that, for those of you that are unfamiliar, I would love to give you some insight about. One area that I would like to particularly highlight is this technology platform. So Coalition is an insurance company. As you can see here, we have about 80,000 policyholders. We're very committed to this world of cyber insurance. We operate our own admitted insurance company in the United States, and then we do operate in some areas on a non-admitted basis and operate as an MGA in some areas of our business, as you can see the carrier partners here. However, the area that I'd like to highlight is we also operate a technology platform. You can see we have over 125,000 users of this platform, consumers of this data. What Coalition did was built what we call a signals intelligence platform. And this technology goes out and, for lack of a better term, scans the internet, collecting information that is publicly visible across the internet. If you think about hacking and how adversaries operate, very rarely is an adversary walking into a building and installing malware via USB drive in a server room or something of that nature. That's pretty cool and mission impossible. However, generally today, adversaries do this from their desk. And what they do is they do exactly what Coalition is attempting to do, which is scan the internet, and they look for signals that they have written code for that enables them to enter a company. Now, just to be clear, the data that Coalition collects and the data that adversaries are monitoring is publicly available data. This is this concept of walking down the street and looking at a building and simply, observing how often are windows open, how often are doors left unlocked. The nuance between Coalition and the adversary in terms of this data collection effort is the adversary's walking through the door or walking, climbing through the window. At Coalition, we're simply monitoring the same data, the same information that adversary is, in order to have a better understanding of what the threat vectors are, what are the key gateways or entry points for adversaries, and most notably, what are the nuances between a good risk and a risk that's not as good. This technology captures, as you can see, about 48 trillion data signals every month. We monitor about 5 to 8 billion devices that are connected to the internet. To describe this in a different term, Coalition monitors every IPv4 address that's available on the internet and a few 100 million IPv6 addresses. To put this in perspective, IPv6, there are more IPv6 IP addresses than there are atoms on the planet Earth. That is a mass scale data collection effort. Now, the nuance here is we collect this information in the spirit, as I mentioned, to understand what an adversary could do to a company. We look at an account through the lens of an adversary. We also take this information and we correlate it directly to insuring agreements. So, for example, if we saw a company that had an industrial control system or a SCADA system that was publicly visible on the internet, that would directly impact this company's ability to obtain bodily injury or property damage related coverage on a cyber form, which Coalition offers. To say it differently, the risk is correlated to the insuring agreement. Internally at Coalition, we often say we take ones and zeros, code, if you will, and we translate that to dollars and cents premium, right? And that's an interesting way that we think about this problem. We do this. This slide's a bit conservative. Coalition has about 650 employees today. Fully 60% of those employees are dedicated to security, technology, and engineering. Right? These are individuals, many of whom played offense for the U.S. government. So it gives you a bit of a profile view on how Coalition thinks about this. Many people look at Coalition and say, wow, that's a pretty interesting insurance company with some really cool technology. And I think that's true, right? However, the reality is we operate as a technology company in the world of insurance because we believe that the nature of cyber is so dynamic that it requires not only mass scale data collection, but machine learning and artificial intelligence in order to collect that information, analyze that information, and then appropriately use it for underwriting purposes.
Sean, one of the things that's fascinating about Coalition is your leadership. Can you explain where did they come from?
Yeah. So Ward mentioned kind of my history at Aon. When I left Aon, I was responsible for their technology clients to represent insurance expertise. Our head of underwriting at Coalition ran underwriting at Swiss Re, AXA, and CNA for cyber. Just to give you a sense of some of the underwriting talent. However, our founders are very unique individuals, not just in the world of insurance, but in the broader kind of US economy, at least. One of them, Joshua Mata, sold his first company to Microsoft when he was 14, then worked at the Central Intelligence Agency after high school for a period of time where he was heavily involved in threat intelligence and offensive kind of cyber warfare for the US government. Then was an early employee at a company called Cloudflare, which went public in 2019 at a height of about $80 billion. Our other founder, John Herring, was Forbes 30 Under 30, founded a company called Lookout, which was historically recognized as one of the world's largest mobile security firms. Our head of engineering ran a $2 billion business at Amazon Web Services. Our head of product was a very early employee at Google's cloud business. And so a pretty unique group of individuals attacking this problem of cyber. And I believe it was very deliberate in building a team of this nature. I think of Coalition as three legs of a stool, right? Now, clearly, security is one of those, this idea of looking at an account through the lens of an adversary. Insurance is absolutely the other one. However, the third leg of the stool is technology, differentiated from security, in that we had to build a technology engine that would capture this information quickly, that would be able to then correlate those things to insuring agreements and deliver a product to our broker partners and policyholders that would deliver value in terms of speed and efficiency in managing cyber risk. Great question, Ward.
Well, it's safe to say, I mean, when I looked at your organization and talked to your leadership, what I saw was MI5, CIA, FBI, deep technology background. You were attacking the problem very differently than a typical insurance company was attacking the problem. You were looking at the data differently, and you're actively using it differently. So, and that leads us really to your next slide, which is really about active insurance. Talk to us about how that works.
Yeah, this idea, the notion of building technology that collects the information that I mentioned, quite literally this idea of underwriting the internet. It enabled us to do a few things, right? If I start on the bottom left here, it allowed us to actually correlate the data that we were collecting in our process to underwriting. So for example, we recently released a claim report, which is publicly available. And in that claims report, we identified the nuances that we saw in terms of users of Microsoft for email versus users of Google Suite for Business for email. Email is the most common vector that is attacked by adversaries, so it's worth kind of noticing this. However, it gave us the ability to recognize that we could actually price discriminate Microsoft versus Google from an underwriting standpoint, right? Because the risks were different, right? And we certainly have hypotheses around why that's the case. But this idea of actively assessing the risk through the underwriting process was the first thing we did. Now, because we built the technology on, let's call it modern infrastructure, API-enabled infrastructure, it's not something that we have to redo every time we want to run the engine again. So this notion of looking across the internet, across IP ranges for a particular policyholder, we don't only have to do at the moment of underwriting. We can continuously run that engine in behalf of our policyholders. So when our policyholder makes a decision that we believe could lead to a claim, i.e., software that's being dramatically attacked by adversaries, or leaving software that's not patched. To describe it differently, if I live in a neighborhood, Coalition has the ability to recognize that there's a robber beginning to enter the neighborhood and attacking other homes. Now we have a policyholder that's a few streets away. Well, we'll proactively notify the policyholder. We'll send them an email saying, hey, you're running this particular version of this software, which we can see is being exploited by adversaries throughout your particular industry segment. Here's how to fix it. Oh, and by the way, here's kind of ready access to Coalition. You can schedule a meeting in one click. We can help you fix it at no cost. Right. So this idea of not only informing an individual that, hey, your house may be broken into in the next couple of days, but also here's the security lock that can prevent them from accessing your infrastructure, your home, is something that Coalition does. The final thing I'll mention, this is kind of an interesting dynamic in cyber, which is very different from any other area of insurance, which is in cyber, when a claim occurs, the insurance industry sends the claim to third parties. And I want to be clear about this. This is a positive thing. These are third parties known as digital forensic incident response teams, right? And these are companies who deploy and basically get the adversary out of the network. And I applaud this effort because the insurance industry needs companies who can do this, right? That expertise doesn't really exist in the industry. This is the firefighter, right? This is the entity that puts the fire out of a building that's burning. Now, there's a problem with this, right? I'll mention three problems. The first problem is the insurance company doesn't control the customer experience. In the darkest day, right, when your servers are down, you can't access your email, the insurance company is really challenged by helping in that scenario. The second problem is these incident response teams, they don't determine root cause analysis. Now, that's not surprising. What they're trying to do is get the fire out and then move on to the next home that's burning, right? But what happened if they did? What happened if they kind of determined that Equifax was breached due to a technology called Apache Struts? Well, if they went back to the insurance company and provided that information, the insurance company has some challenges around what to do with that, right? Because the technical acumen isn't there. At Coalition, we felt like there was a better way. And so what we did is we built our own incident response team that solves these problems, right? Number one, we kind of manage and assist the client in their darkest day. Number two, we determine root cause analysis. Number three, we take that information and we feed it back into underwriting. Now, this is not rocket science. In insurance, we learn from claims and we improve underwriting. But rather than simply go to underwriting and say, hey, that's a fire, i.e., that's ransomware, we can pay claims. We can learn the particular software, the gateway for entry for an adversary is something that we should build into our underwriting engine. The final thing we'll do, and I didn't highlight this, is that we have the ability to solve claims. Thus far in 2023, about $31 million, which represents 68% of the funds that were fraudulently transferred away from Coalition's policyholders due to social engineering, we've actually retracted the monies. We've recovered the monies from adversarial groups. Well, that's money, just to be clear. This is not about insurance, right? Oftentimes, the limit that's provided for social engineering is commonly sublimited to like $200,000 or $500,000. We'll recover the entirety of the limit for our policyholder and then enable the insurance to be available for other claims. So this whole process, actively assessing risk, actively protecting risk, or actively responding. It's this idea of thinking of cyber policy not like really a D&O policy, which you think of at a claim or at renewal, but perhaps more like a workers' compensation policy that's attempting to actively provide you value throughout the policy period. On the next slide, we just kind of demonstrate the impact of this on coalition, right? Where the next slide shows how this actively lowers losses as well, right? This slide looks a bit odd, but anyway, how this whole process of collecting data, using that data to lower losses, allows us to then complete this feedback loop in cyber.
So Sean, let me ask you a question. Let's
Please.
say first of all, I want to ask, what does the policyholder look like? Who is your target audience? That's number one. Number two, let's say I'm a policyholder, and you're starting to tell me, you're signaling to me that a bad guy's on its way, and you've told me how to defend. What happens if the bad guy is actually on its way? How does Coalition's technology help me from not having the claim to begin with? Can you interdict in that case? So first of all, who's the customer, and what does that claims process kind of look like?
Yeah. So firstly, Coalition, we write companies up to $5 billion in revenue. And so it gives you kind of, we operate in the segment from like 0 to 5 billion. Secondly, cyber is very different than other risks, right? And it's different because many risks in insurance we address stochastically, right? And the profile of a risk, secondly, the profile of a risk when a hurricane's coming to the southeast kind of seaboard of the United States, we expect the hurricane to do damage. Like the work around risk mitigation, you can board windows, you can go into hurricane shelters and things of that nature. But the damage that we expect it to incur on buildings is going to happen, right? And we can model that risk, we assess that risk. Cyber is different. There's something known as a kill chain in cyber. This was something developed by Lockheed Martin decades ago, where an adversary will enter a network and do reconnaissance, right? They will take time in order to evaluate the network, what opportunities there are in order to move laterally, to infiltrate a company appropriately, right? So an adversary, there's a variety of steps they'll take. They'll then weaponize their tool. They'll deliver the malware. They'll exploit the company. They'll then install it across multiple systems. And then only after that moment, they'll take command and control. This process takes time, and it also takes resources. Well, with time and with resources, the time that it takes to exploit, there's an opportunity to interdict and play a role in mitigating, right? So if you know the adversary is coming, there's lots of options you have, actually. You can update the software. You can put it behind a VPN, right? You can remove the technology. There's a variety of tools and services available when you know. And it's one of the reasons why catastrophic modeling in cyber versus that in property is so differentiated. Now, I saw a question that came up, Ward, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and take that one.
Absolutely.
The question came from Dwight. What controls and checks are in place for Coalition relative to privacy concerns? With the company being responsible for so much data, what assurances does the organization give to clients from a fiduciary point of view? Now, this is a good question. So I want to distinguish items that are behind the door, if you will, behind the firewall, versus items that are publicly visible. If an adversary has entered your network, then they're inside, they're behind the firewall. We kind of start with the premise at Coalition that everything is hackable. In fact, quick sidebar, John Herring, one of the founders of Coalition, many of you may remember a few years ago, well, this is actually about 5 years ago, there was an individual that was on 60 Minutes and hacked the reporter's phone on air. That was actually John Herring. So that was one of the founders of Coalition. So when we think about things that are behind the firewall, those are private, right? It is illegal to do that and to go behind the firewall. Now, adversaries certainly don't operate within legal bounds, right? Unfortunately. So, however, every company, and I'll show you a slide on this here in a minute, every company exposes a variety of things publicly in order to operate your business from a technology standpoint. A very common thing that you will expose is what technology you use to kind of operate your website, right? Your publicly available website, right? Now, if your website is a picture book and it shows pictures of your executives and that's kind of it, well, no big deal, right? Like an adversary, they're not really going to access anything by kind of understanding you use WordPress for your website. However, if your website has an e-commerce tool, if it has a login for employees to access working remotely, if it has a variety of other things, then those produce far greater risks, right, around how you think about your website. Email is another one, right? So at Coalition, we're never going to cross that line, obviously, being kind of a company that operates within those legal binds. But that data, whether there's the privatization or codification of privacy around the world is a growing topic in many jurisdictions. GDPR, Australian Privacy Directive, many U.S. states operate their own privacy-related code, and so those are all things that we look at in terms of assessing privacy at Coalition.
So let me give you a scenario, a claim scenario. Let's say I'm a policyholder and we know that a bad guy's on the way, all right? You prevent the bad guy from taking something from me, impacting the policy. Was that a loss or not?
I want to make sure I understand the question properly, Ward.
So I have a policy in place. Premiums are all paid in, everything's all good. I'm doing everything that I'm supposed to do to protect that policy. But we notice an adversary, or you notice that an adversary is on the way, and the adversary is getting close. But the adversary hasn't breached me at all yet. Is that a loss? Is the approach of an adversary the definition of a loss, or is it something else under your policy structure?
Yeah, it's interesting. We have experiences at Coalition where I'll take it a step further. We'll actually notify a policyholder that they've been breached, that we can see the adversary in their network acting, and I'll show you how we do that in a bit. Now, legally, we cannot instigate the claim, right? The policyholder needs to file the claim, right? And it's kind of this interesting idea, like, is that something we should notify? And our belief is, number one, let's be clear, it's the right thing to do to inform them about that, right? But number two, we've also learned that when we do that, the ability to act quickly in a claim scenario allows us to reduce the cost of the claim in a significant fashion. And so that is actually a common experience that happens at Coalition. We desire to stand hip to hip with our policyholder in terms of managing cyber risk.
So if nothing has been taken, I've suffered no economic loss, my systems have not been damaged, etc. That means it's not impacted the policy, which means what you've put in place as a mitigation, an advanced mitigation tool, prevented the loss from actually taking place because I haven't reported a loss, which means my renewal next year is going to look loss-free. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
that's exactly.
So that's a fundamental difference between what you're doing from a technology standpoint and what the insurance community or industry has been doing, because they're playing defense most of the time. What you've done has been not only to recover stuff that has been lost, but you've actually prevented the loss from occurring to begin with, and that protects the policy, that protects you, it protects the policy holder for all kinds of other issues that are out there. And so that really kind of takes you to the next slide, which is, how do you do that?
Yeah, thank you. Um, one of the things that we deploy at Coalition is something known as a honeypot. Now, if you think about Winnie the Pooh, you put out a pot of honey and you wait for the bears to come, right? Dwight, I like that comment about the moat. Thank you. So this idea of what we did to use this analogy of the honeypot is we put out about 300 machines virtually around the world, and we left every single port open, about which amounts to about 65,000 ports on every virtual machine. And then what we did is we allow these machines to portray that they are running the technologies that are utilized by our policyholders that are publicly visible, right? And we do this for the explicit purpose of understanding what are adversaries doing, okay? Now, I ran this about a week ago, and you can see that in the last 30 days, which is what's being identified here, Coalition's honeypots on the top left were attacked by adversaries 25.7 billion times, right? Now, there's other companies, security companies, that go out and scan the internet. So we remove those companies from these events. And then what we do is we have a lot of data that allows us to understand what are adversaries attacking, right? So we can see where the IP addresses are emanating from adversaries, right? In this bucket where it says attacker countries. Now that's okay. There's lots of ways in which you can obfuscate your IP address. We know that. So we're not surprised to see the US there, China, Russia, etc. However, what we then do is we tag every single port that's available, right? So one thing you'll find interesting here is there's a Microsoft technology called Remote Desktop Protocol. This was prolifically utilized throughout the pandemic and continues to be utilized today, where Remote Desktop Protocol allows, through a simple username and password, to enter a corporate network and work remotely. Very useful technology. However, this same technology, adversaries scanned 3.3 billion times. Now, why are adversaries scanning this technology? Why are they so focused there, right? Well, because if I know that Sean Ram has an email address, which is sean@coalitioninc.com, and if I know Sean also is a user of LinkedIn, and in 2016, Sean's password on LinkedIn was the name of his high school, which was not true, by the way. But if it was, then maybe as an adversary, I'm going to try that same password on his RDP for his corporate network. And because I can simply brute force millions of passwords into that particular remote desktop protocol, eventually I'll get in. In fact, when we put up a new virtual machine, it gets scanned for RDP within 15 seconds. So to Ward's point, how do we know what adversaries are attacking? We just watch, we monitor it, right? Now, there's another value of this honeypot, which is if for some reason we see an IP address of one of our policyholders that's connecting to the honeypot, that's a really bad thing. That should never happen. That tells us that an adversary has taken over an IP range or address, a machine of our policyholder, and they're connecting to the wrong place. So what we're doing here is doing our best to monitor what adversaries are doing, such that, number one, we just hand this information at no cost to our policyholders, so they're aware. But number two, we also monitor all this information in order to improve underwriting, so we don't underwrite. Like today, frankly, we decline accounts that have remote desktop protocol publicly visible on the internet. But also, when a policyholder opens up RDP throughout the policy period, we inform them, hey, RDP is a bad thing, and this is the data that demonstrates it's a bad thing. Would you please shut that down? Put it behind a VPN, right? Kind of enable multi-factor authentication. There's lots of things that a company could do at no cost, frankly, to remove this risk profile from their company. So it's a very data-driven approach is the concept here.
So Sean, we have an interesting question in the chat from Keith. He's saying, I love the proactive approach and I'm unaware of any suits regarding agents/agency E&O. Does being so proactive create a possible situation for an E&O if a hacker does get through?
I've had this question from brokers in the past. We've had some policyholders ask this as well. Our belief is a few things. Number one, there's a fiduciary duty that we all have to improve cybersecurity, right? So simply being notified that there could be that you have, like me telling you that it's unpatched, that you have unpatched software, there's no E&O there because it's public information. Like I'm not kind of telling you something that's not publicly visible. Now you have to know where to find it, right? You have to know how to access it, but it's not something that's proprietary. It's not like I'm telling you, hey, you have a rogue employee that's doing something nefarious that could cause harm. Like I can't, that's not something I know because that would be very private. But the fact that it's public information removes a lot of E&O. This natural fiduciary duty that we all have in the United States, at least I'll highlight as kind of corporate citizens across various state laws is another one. The other area here is it's still up to the policyholder to act, right? And to do something. Like we're simply informing them of something, their decision to act. There's a lot of things. Like I use RDP because that's an easy example, but if I use something like SSL, as you can see here, like the security certificates that happen on websites, there might be reasons why, or actually, let me give you the RDP example. We flagged one particular company for RDP. It was a large not-for-profit, and they said, hey, we're completely aware of the risks associated with RDP. However, we have a large contingency of volunteers in Africa, and they don't have the ability to utilize multi-factor authentication like we desire them to. And they're accessing this on mobile devices. So we need to keep RDP open to access that volunteer base. By the way, behind RDP is just a calendaring function, right? So we don't believe it's segregated from our network. There's no risk we have there. And so my point here is sometimes we don't know what all of these facets were behind this particular RDP. We're simply informing you of what we can see on the internet. The final thing I'll mention, although I recognize in cyber this may appear unique, and I think it is, and definitely proactive, there are other areas of insurance where we operate in this fashion, right? So there are property carriers that will commonly do property assessments of buildings and provide you a report of their recommendations of changes in order to improve the risk of a property. I mentioned workers' compensation, where someone might do an ergonomic training and provide you counseling on how to avoid claims from a workers' compensation standpoint. We're simply applying some of these similar risk management tactics to cyber. But great question. I see the question around ransomware payments. Yes, we do. That is a common, a standard coverage that we offer in the United States, in fact, in all our geographies around the world. This idea of handling ransomware payments, if the perpetrator is sanctioned, we have extremely close relationships with the FBI and the United States Secret Service. So it is legal to provide a ransomware payment to a sanctioned entity. And so we would vet that discussion with authorities and obviously through the policyholder, through breach counsel, before that were to occur. So that's a very common and frankly standard practice today amongst insurance companies. Good question. David, yeah, this one's a big one, right? David asked the question around a war exclusion and what constitutes a cyber war. How would we handle such an event? What I wanted, this is a large topic that was largely promulgated through Lloyd's. Lloyd's established some language around war exclusion that they're imposing upon the marketplace, which makes sense, right? The challenge with cyber war, different from other areas of war, In fact, Ward showed some data earlier where he showed ransomware, and you saw there was a dip in ransomware that occurred in 2022. Coalition, we believed this would occur. We actually, that did not surprise us at all. And the reason for that was because the lines between Russia, when Ukraine and Russia had their conflict, the lines between adversarial groups in Russia and government are blurred, right? So when a Russian adversary attacks a U.S. corporation, to some degree, adversaries are very boastful. They like to comment on their attacks. Well, that's kind of easy to determine that, hey, this came from this adversary, oftentimes. However, the connection, attribution to a government is far more difficult. Certainly, a government can say, hey, we were the ones that performed this attack. And then it's like clear and stated. But generally, that does not occur. And countries like Russia, North Korea, and others, because those lines are so blurred, the notion of attribution for a cyber-related war is challenging, right? And so that is the challenge with the war exclusion, is truly identifying that it was an act of war. More commonly, what we see is that it was simply an act from an adversary. Right. And so in most cases, or in virtually every case, we don't see the war exclusion applying. Okay, great. On the comment, the slide that I had around Move It, I was just attempting to demonstrate kind of this idea of a honeypot in action, right? Some of you who are close to the space, there was a notable vulnerability that was deployed on May 31st of this year, and it's impacted the entire cyber industry. At Coalition, frankly, we looked at this vulnerability as just the 101st vulnerability, if you will, right? It was just another vulnerability. But the reason why this virtually had zero impact to Coalition on this very kind of grave vulnerability is because we actually saw it 6 months ago. Right. So in November of last year, we saw activity on our honeypots for this very notable vulnerability. So we notified our policyholders, and concurrently, we began kind of applying a contingency on our quotes that, hey, you need to move it in order for our quote to be valid, to basically update and patch the software. Well, there are many companies that look at that and they say, I'll move it. I haven't even heard about this. Like, it's not really that big of a deal. Whereas our honeypot saw this very prominent vulnerability greater than 6 months before it happened. And it allowed us to not only protect our policyholders from being exposed to this massive attack that occurred in May, but it also protected Coalition from a claims perspective as well. We actually haven't had any Move It claims as a result of this exercise. So the value of honeypots, like, we're really good at understanding what's going to happen 3 to 6 months from now. I don't think anyone can really predict what's going to happen a year from now, right? Because adversaries work a lot faster than that cadence.
So Sean, being cognizant of time, I think we have just a few minutes left. We are only 1% of the way here, so way there. So what's next for Coalition?
Yeah, this is kind of a slogan or a theme we have within our company where I oftentimes say, hey, this is the best we've ever been, but it's the worst you'll ever see. As a technology company, we're updating our technology 3 to 4 times a week, right? Although we progress as a company, our vision for how to solve cyber increases greater than that 1%, right? So we're continuously only 1% of the way there. And so it's really intended to be a closing slide around how we think about cyber risk. Dwight asked the question, what is the typical policy duration of a Coalition contract? That is, it's 365 days. It's most commonly a 1-year contract for cyber. And I think that's likely to be here for a while. I mean, there are other areas of insurance where you see multi-year policies, but due to the dynamic nature of cyber risk and how that operates, I think the 1-year policy is going to be very common. I oftentimes hear, because we operate at scale, right? Our system can generate about 10,000 quotations per minute. Like I have companies who approach us and say, hey, we impose this burden, this contractual standard that all our vendors have to have a certain cyber policy. Coalition, we make that very easy to kind of implement a project like that and require standards, have visibility around all that. But sometimes in those processes, people ask me, hey, is it possible to do a far smaller contract? And yes, that is that. I think there are some entities who value like monthly contracts in cyber. Or every quarterly contracts in cyber, and those are things that I think are far more viable than the longer term nature of a cyber contract.
I think we have just 1 or 2 minutes left. If anyone else has a final question for Sean. And if not, just want to say thank you so much, Sean. This has been fascinating. Lots of activity in the chat as well. So thanks to everyone for being engaged and asking questions. With that, I believe we are going to take a 10-minute break until 11:20. And the next session will be the awards. But just want to say thank you again, Sean, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, pleasure being with you. Have a good day, everyone.